Hi everybody, this is the only chapter in Guthrie that we're going to be looking at this week, and this is the notion of managing capital projects and fiscal resources. We're going to talk about the state regulations in here, but this is really giving you what capital projects look like for districts. Remember the perspective of this book, as I keep saying. This is the book that you have if you're learning how to be a school business administrator. This is not the book if you're learning how to be a superintendent and learning about school finance. So it's a little dry, but I wanted to highlight some things that I think are pretty important. So I give you some of the main ideas behind here. One of the things that we're really going to stress, we're going to talk about this idea of debt, what accounts payable, short-term debt, and long-term debt looks like. I think that's one of the biggest ideas in this chapter. This is Business Manager 101. These are things you're going to be responsible for at some point as an administrator, but like I said, we're going to look at these briefly, and these are some of the big topics that business managers do in their positions. So capital funding matters because it's a long-term project that is paid for by multiple generations of users. Think if your district got a new football stadium or got a new baseball stadium, what that would look like. Well, it would be a capital funding issue. And it could be paid for over time in most instances, or it could be done by generous grant or donations. But it's going to be something that affects a lot of people for a long amount of time, and that's why we worry about capital funding. So capital construction is basically the constructions of buildings and resources, and that's tied to demographic trends in the district. This is why I want you to get in the habit of strategic planning. What I think matters in 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years is important here because that's what capital construction is and what it looks like. So, what should you know? What are the big ideas? Schools overestimate the number of students they expect. That's good. You should overestimate the number of students because kids move in all the time and they can come out of nowhere. They could be homeschooled one day and in the public school system the next day. But city and state officials underestimate the number of students they expect, and that reduces costs. So there should be this kind of balance between the two of them, and that tends to be what occurs. So the NCES enrollment trends, you're going to see this in all of our textbooks because everybody goes by statistics and numbers. I don't trust this stuff. I trust what happens in organizations, and organizational theory tells me that it's district and state specific. It is not worldwide. I mean, you can say schools are growing worldwide, so everybody needs to prepare, but I know that's not the truth. It isn't. It's district specific and it's state specific, and that's what matters. So this part of the chapter goes what happens when you build a new school. I think this is important, and if one of your projections is my district needs a new school, you should really look at this and know this. So the first thing that you do is you find out the extent of need, meaning how many students for a minimum of the next 5 years. Because if you're building a new school, you want to look at birth rates. You want to see if people are moving in the district. You also want to see if they're renting versus owning, because owning makes all the difference in the world. And then you need to see if there are any alternatives to building a new school. Shifting population. Why not build a 6th grade center? Why not build a 7th grade center? Why not move some kids from a middle school to an elementary school? See if there's a way that you could consolidate or merge with another school district. That could be a big idea. Some people might not want to hear that, but it's something you might want to do. The book suggests this, and I found this working very effectively in Pennsylvania, but you have to be careful on this. This notion of the mobile classroom. By a mobile classroom, if you know that you're going to have 6 3rd grades 1 year, and the next year you have 2 2nd grades, buy a mobile classroom that just moves and use that instead of investing in a building if everybody just decided to have babies 1 year, which does happen. You might have a shifting population. The other thing that could happen are religious schools. Charter religious schools are structured for school already. Catholic schools are. So buy that property and possibly use that property. If there are no feasible alternatives, then you determine location. My belief is that location really needs to revolve around your transportation costs, and you have to look at where the new housing units are. Easiest way to make a housing unit go up in value is to open up an elementary school next to the housing unit. Easy way to make a housing unit go down in value, open up the high school next to the housing unit. So land acquisition, how I would present this in Oklahoma is different than how I would present it in Florida. Many individuals support land acquisition, but remember, you're also dealing with big business, you're dealing with drilling, you're dealing with oil considerations as well. So districts need to try to include those in their district calculations, but also distance themselves from them when necessary. So next, you select an architectural firm. Quality should be the #1 goal while saving money, but I always suggest that you visit other schools designed by the same firm. You want to see somebody else's work. Did it look good? Is it effective? Did they come up with something that was really cool that might be a money saver? The room we're in right now, you can't see it, but think about, are there plugs in the desks? If there are plugs in the desks, that's awesome. And we can determine whether or not that creates a feasible vision or not. So then we advertise for bidding. We're going to look really at the bidding procedure a little bit later on in the class, but you will advertise for bids, and that depends on how the district does it and also how the state does it as well. So when construction exists, most of the time there will be a 40-hour-a-week full-time inspector who's on the job at all time, really making sure that the project work is there and they inspected it before it's finalized. This will protect from fraudulent construction, which is always a very good thing. Then we have a formal acceptance of a building after the architect has certified the school board that the construction is complete and satisfactory. This is the ribbon cutting ceremony, and final pay occurs. The district is ready, the facility can be opened, and kids are good to go into school. And that's pretty much our way of looking at what the construction process is. Obviously, this doesn't happen overnight. This happens a little bit at a time, but it's certainly something that you want to consider. So in larger urban districts, when you see surplus facilities, the district will try to convert it to other uses because then you can recover money. If you can't use the building again, try to sell it, but if you can take the building and turn it into a tutoring center, an alternative center, a testing center, you're saving the district money and you're using property that the district owns already, which if you can do that, that is also another winning situation as well. So the big idea from this chapter, the one thing that I want you to use as the takeaway message, is this notion of the 3 categories of debt. When we're looking at these, we're looking at accounts payable, short-term debt, and long-term debt. I want to highlight this because this is different than how I would present it. I think of short-term debt as something that's like a credit card, a car payment, something like that. Anytime I put something on a credit card, I call that short-term debt. Well, Guthrie doesn't. Guthrie uses the term accounts payable that basically says accounts payable is something that you buy something, they invoice you, you pay it, it's gone. So the example that I can use best would be if your district was adopting a new curriculum library or a new set of books for a history class. You buy them, they invoice you, you pay them, you pay it at full before the end of the capitalization period. Short-term debt, for me, I call it credit card debt, but for schools and organizations, this would be a bank loan. This is something that's a loan, it exists for a little bit of time, and the school and organization uses it for what it is, and that tends to be what short-term debt is, and interest is acquired, and that kind of makes it go that way. Long-term debt is financed over time. This can be an automobile expense or a mortgage, but for school districts, this is your large bonds when financing a building. The districts have to tax the residents to raise money for it, and that's kind of what makes it long-term debt. The district has to justify it, and then they justify it by imposing a tax. So why should you have short-term debt? Short-term debt can actually be good if it's going to make the district profitable in the long run. If you have an employee that's a waste of a human life, that's there on a 5-year contract, that's not doing anything, and they're in year 2, well, you're wasting time investing in that employee if you can't get rid of them when you could simply offer them a buyout. It sets the district up to be profitable in the future. Short-term debt doesn't require votes by the school district, which is a good thing, and that's something that the district has to choose and go with if they want to engage with that. Now, on the other hand, I think it's important to note that long-term debt has to have a large vote from people. It could be 2/3 or it could be 3/4 vote from constituents. That's so that district residents can actually have input and say. If you have to get something that people really believe in to get a 3/4 vote. So that's another thing that can be a challenge for you as a resident of a district. Once the district has incurred debt, you have to decide whether or not you're going to actually use bonds. So if you do a bond, you really need to employ a legal counsel, because you as the superintendent, let's be blunt, you ain't going to be there for 30 years for the bond to be paid off, and you're going to be making debt for the next person to come along. That's a problem. So you need to make sure that there are consultants that can say this is the right decision. So most importantly, you are not blamed for it, and that's the last thing that we want to happen. We don't want you to be blamed for any problems that could occur. So after the political approval of the bond, the district finds a purchaser. They advertise bids. They require a bond rating by a bond agency, and we cover this a little bit more in the Brimley text as well. So bonds are rated using two different scales. They're rated using Standards & Poor's and Moody's. My guess is that you're going to be using the Standard & Poor's rating in most of your school districts. That helps you know really the potential if the bond is a good investment or if it's risky by some reason. So interest and principal payments. If you have a term bond, these are the most common. Interest is paid on it semi-annually. The principal falls on a specific date. A serial bond basically says, you know, that the principal and interest payments are approximately the same each year, and those ones really, you know, balance it out, and they keep the interest and principal rate the same, so it really doesn't bother you to try to get ahead with those particular type of bonds. So here's the problem that we run into more than anything else. The fact that most people don't want to pass bond elections. They don't want to increase the funding in schools. We're dealing with this and we're having problems with this, and it means that our cost of borrowing has increased substantially, meaning that we need state funding and federal funding, which also creates this dichotomy between who's supplying the money. When a bond does pass, different people and different residents end up with debt, and that's who ends up with it in the future. So all that I can tell you is this is something that I would encourage you to research before becoming a superintendent. You might end up with debt that you don't want to occur, and then that's pretty much it for this particular chapter, and we're going to look really at different type of management and expenditures when we go back into the Guthrie text. Thank you.